Welcome back to Eternal Diary. I have been sitting with this script for 2 days now, and the moment I keep returning to is so small it could be missed entirely. She does not run, she does not confront, she simply turns in a different direction at a gala, and that one turn is everything. You're watching Eternal Diary. The first thing I noticed when I came back was the smell of my own apartment. Cheap coffee and old wood, and the particular staleness of a space that belonged to someone who worked too hard and slept too little. I lay on my back staring at a crack in the ceiling I had stared at 100 times before, and for a long moment I thought I was dreaming. Then I moved my left hand. No ring, no scar from where the ring had cut into my swollen fingers after the accident. No bruising along my forearm, no IV line, no hospital, just my hand, thin and unadorned, lying against a cotton duvet cover I had owned years ago and eventually thrown away. I sat up slowly. The alarm clock on the nightstand read 6:47 a.m. It was the old alarm clock, the one I had replaced after Callum told me it looked cheap. The date on the display said the 14th of March. Oh, 3 years and 4 months before the night of the accident. I pressed my feet to the floor and stayed very still. Outside, a garbage truck was working its way down the street. I could hear the hydraulic compression, the clang of the container, a man shouting something to another man. Ordinary sounds. I focused on them because I needed to understand if what I was experiencing was real or if something in me had simply broken. After about 10 minutes, I concluded it was real. I went to the bathroom, filled the sink, and put my face in the cold water. I held it there until my lungs ached. When I came up, the woman in the mirror looked younger than I remembered. There were no shadows under her eyes yet. She had not learned to hold her jaw the way I held mine by the end. I dried my face with a hand towel and went to put the kettle on. And then while it boiled, I sat at the small kitchen table and thought through what I knew. In the life I had just left, I had spent 3.5 years being in love with Callum Ashfield, Callum, who was 29 when I met him. Beautiful in the specific way of men who have never been told no. Who inherited his father's company name, but none of his father's patience. Who told me I was the only woman he had ever wanted to build something with, and who said this on no fewer than 6 occasions that I could recall, each time in a setting calibrated to make the words feel permanent. I had believed him every time. I had used the savings I built over 4 years of financial consultancy work to invest in a series of deals he brought to me. Deals he said were opportunities, private equity positions that would mature into something real. The moment I had turned down a senior partnership offer at Greystone Capital to stay available for a life with him, a life he kept describing as imminent. I had introduced him to my network, my clients, my mentor of 12 years. I had made him seem credible to people who might otherwise have looked more carefully at the gap between his ambition and his competence. And in return, he had spent the last 8 months of our relationship quietly routing those investments through a shell company he co-owned with Arabella Delphine, a woman he had been seeing since long before we met. The accident happened 4 days after I found out. I was never entirely sure it was an accident. The kettle clicked off. I poured water over the coffee grounds and watched the bloom rise and fall. What I knew, by sitting in that kitchen on the 14th of March, 3 years and 4 months before my death, was this. Callum had not yet approached me. We had not yet met. The gala at the Pendleton Hotel, the event where we were introduced by a mutual acquaintance in the atrium near the East Bar, was happening tonight. I had attended that gala in my first life wearing a silver dress I saved 3 weeks of lunches to afford. I had stood near the bar feeling slightly out of place, nursing a drink I did not want, and a man had appeared at my left shoulder and said something that made me laugh. Tonight, I was going to do something different. I drank my coffee. I looked at the ceiling. I began to plan. The Pendleton Hotel had a hum to it at night. Not music exactly, more the concentrated sound of many people performing ease. As the chandeliers in the main atrium threw warm light in all directions, and the air smelled of lilies and money, and, faintly, of the industrial cleaning product the staff used on the floors. I had been here before. I knew where the East Bar was, and I was not going anywhere near it. I was here to find Dorian Ashfield. In my first life, I had met Dorian only twice. Once at a company dinner Callum brought me to, where Dorian sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing. Once at a charity auction where we exchanged perhaps 4 sentences. He was 61 then, silver-haired, with a stillness about him that I had registered as coldness, because I was too young and too much in love with his son to look more carefully. Now I looked more carefully. He was standing near the far windows with a glass of something amber-colored. Enos watching the room with the particular expression of a man who has attended this event for 20 years and has made his peace with the fact that it will not surprise him. He wore a dark suit that fit the way expensive clothes fit when the person wearing them no longer thinks about whether they fit. He was not working the room. He was simply in it. I crossed toward him, adjusting my route twice so that when I arrived near the windows, I appeared to be looking for somewhere quiet to stand, not looking for him specifically. I set my own drink on the ledge and looked out at the city below. After a moment, he said, "They turn the lights up too high in here." I said, "The lilies don't help. You can't think with that smell." He looked at me then, not with interest, not yet. With the mild attention of a man deciding whether a conversation is worth beginning. "Dorian Ashvale?" he said. "Vivian Tyndall." I kept my eyes on the city. "Your company did the refinancing on the Haverstock redevelopment. I worked on the risk modeling." A pause. "That was 4 years ago." "I know. It was interesting work. The land covenant issue in the third tranche was handled in a way I hadn't seen before." He was quiet for a moment, and I could feel him recalibrating. I was not, clearly, what he had expected from a woman in a green dress making quiet conversation near the windows. "You're in finance," he said. "Was. I moved into independent advisory 18 months ago." "Was it better?" I turned to look at him. "Not yet, but it will be." That was the beginning. I did not move quickly. That was the first rule I set myself. Sitting at the kitchen table on the morning of the 14th, drawing up a plan that was not yet fully formed but had an architecture I could feel. Dorian Ashvale was not a foolish man. He would not be charmed by flattery or rushed by urgency. He had spent 40 years building Thornfield Group from a single mid-sized property firm into a diversified holding company with interests in commercial real estate, infrastructure financing, and, more recently, renewable energy development. He had done this carefully, with a temperament that valued precision over speed, and he had watched his son spend the last 6 years slowly corroding everything he built, spending lavishly, making public promises the company's balance sheet could not support, and surrounding himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. Samba, what Dorian needed was someone who saw the company clearly, who could tell him the truth about it. I could do that. I had spent 3.5 years watching Callum describe his father's company to investors, clients, journalists, and dinner guests, and I had spent enough of those years doing my own analysis to know that Callum's version and the real version were two very different things. The real version, Thornfield Group, was being hollowed out. The energy division, the newest and most visible, was running on leveraged debt and projected revenues that would not materialize in the timeline Callum had publicly committed to. The commercial real estate portfolio was solid, but overvalued in the company's internal accounting by roughly 30%. The infrastructure financing arm, the oldest and most reliable division, also was being systematically starved of capital because Callum found it boring and because it generated the kind of steady, unglamorous returns that did not photograph well. If nothing changed, Thornfield would be in serious distress within 2 years. Callum and Arabella's scheme was not a side operation. It was an exit strategy. They were extracting value now because they planned to be elsewhere when the collapse came. Dorian did not know this. Or rather, he suspected something was wrong and had been quietly told by people around him that he was being paranoid, that his son was doing well, that the company was in capable hands. I knew exactly how that felt. In the weeks after the gala, I met Dorian 3 more times. Once for lunch, at his invitation, to discuss the Haverstock covenant model at more length. Once at an industry event where I made sure to be someone he encountered rather than someone who sought him out. Once for coffee, his suggestion, after I sent him a short written analysis of a publicly reported deal in the infrastructure sector that contained an observation he later told me he had not seen in 3 years of looking at the same market. I was not seducing him. I was not pretending to be something I was not. I was showing him, carefully and without announcement, exactly what I was. By June, he called me by my first name without pausing before it. By August, we had dinner. The dinner was at a restaurant in the old part of the city, the kind of place with low ceilings and a wine list that assumed you would not need to ask about the prices. Dorian chose it. I arrived 7 minutes after our reservation time. Why not to make him wait, but because I needed the walk from the corner to the door to settle something in me that had been restless all day. He was already seated. He stood when I came in, which no one had done for me in years. We talked about the infrastructure market for 40 minutes, and then the conversation shifted, as conversations do, into something harder to name. He asked me why I left Greystone Capital. I told him the true version, that I had been on track for a senior partnership and had made a personal decision I later regretted. What was the decision? He asked. To prioritize a relationship over a career. The relationship did not survive, and neither did the opportunity. He nodded. Not with pity, with recognition. My son does that to people, he said. It was a quiet statement, not a question, not an accusation. Well, just something he said as if it cost him something to say it. I looked at him for a moment. Is that a warning? It's an observation. He picked up his wine glass. He came to you with investment opportunities. I said nothing. I'm told you made some placements through his network, Dorian said. A few years back, before you went independent. I held my breath carefully so it did not show. You have someone watching his network? I have someone watching mine. He set the glass down. He's my son. I love him. I no longer trust him with my company. The restaurant around us was quiet and warm, and someone at a nearby table was laughing at something. I thought about my apartment in the morning, and the crack in the ceiling, and the alarm clock that said it was the 14th of March. I said, what are you going to do about it? I don't know yet. He looked at me with the directness of someone who has stopped being careful. What would you do? I said, I would need to see the books. It took 4 more months before he showed me the books. In those 4 months, several things happened. Dorian and I continued to meet, with increasing regularity and with a texture that was changing in a direction I was not surprised by and was not pretending to be indifferent to. He was not what I had assumed from a distance. The stillness I had read as coldness was something else entirely. It was the composure of a man who had learned to wait, who trusted process over impulse, who had made enough mistakes with speed to understand the value of not moving until he understood what he was moving toward. He made me feel, more than once, like someone who was worth listening to. I did not let that matter yet. I needed to be useful first. Separately, in those 4 months, I was building something of my own. I had gone back to consulting. I had done this carefully, taking small clients, building a reputation in infrastructure finance that was mine and no one else's. I registered a company, Meridian Advisory, with initial capital that was entirely from my own earnings and savings. I set up its accounts, its structure, its operating agreements with a precision that Crispin Hadley, my solicitor, told me was unusual in someone who was not a lawyer. You've thought about this? He said at our first meeting, looking over the shareholder documentation I had prepared. For longer than you'd think, I said. Meridian was small. It had 4 clients and 1 employee, which was me. But it was clean. Every contract was clear. Every piece of intellectual property was documented and dated. Every client relationship was formalized in writing. I was building the foundation of something before I knew exactly what it would become, and I was building it with the care of someone who understood what it felt like to have a foundation taken from underneath her. In November, Dorian invited me to Thornfield's offices. The offices were on the 11th and 12th floors of a building in the central business district, the kind of space that said money by saying nothing decorative at all. Clean lines, neutral materials, a reception desk staffed by someone who wore the particular expression of a person whose job was to make visitors feel slightly less important than they thought they were. Dorian met me in the corridor outside the finance department, and we walked in together. The CFO, a man called Leopold who had been with the company for 11 years and who, I knew, had been quietly trying to raise concerns about the energy division's accounting for the past 18 months, without result, watched me sit down at the conference room table with the expression of someone who had been told help was coming, but had not been told what shape it would take. I spent 2 days in those offices. I did not tell Leopold what I knew. I did not tell anyone what I knew. I worked through the figures methodically, asking questions that were specific and technical, taking notes that were my own property, forming a picture I was already largely in possession of and was now confirming in detail. So the energy division's debt was not 30% worse than reported. It was worse than that. The projected revenue figures had been based on supply agreements that had been signed but never funded, counterparties who had committed in principle and quietly stepped back. The agreements were still in the company's records because removing them would have made the division's projections obviously unsupportable. The money that had been extracted was not small. Running through a subsidiary called Fenwick Capital Partners, which was registered in a jurisdiction that took some finding, a total of approximately $11 million had been moved in irregular payments over 2.5 years, characterized in the accounts as consulting fees and project development costs. Fenwick Capital Partners was co-owned by 2 individuals. As I did not need to look them up. I finished my notes, closed my folders, and spent a long moment in the bathroom off the conference room looking at my own face in the mirror. Then I went back in and spent the 3rd day modeling a recovery scenario. I gave Dorian the full picture on a Thursday evening at his home, a house in one of the quieter residential neighborhoods that smelled of old wood and something faintly like cedar. The kind of smell that said the house had been the same for a long time. He read through my analysis without speaking. It took him 40 minutes. When he set the last page down, he was very still. 11 million, he said. 11.3 by my calculation. Yet the structure used to move it is sophisticated, but not invisible once you know to look for it. You knew to look for it? Yes. He got up and went to the window. Outside, the street was quiet and lit from above by orange street lamps. A cat moved along the pavement below. He's my son, Dorian said. I know. I want to understand the timeline. He kept his face toward the window. How long has he been planning this? I believe he began diverting funds approximately 30 months ago. The entity's structure was set up around the same time he publicly committed to the energy division's expansion. The commitment created the noise that made the extraction less visible. He needed the publicity to cover the theft. Yes, Dorian was quiet for a long time. When he turned back, his face was composed, but there was something in his eyes that I recognized because I had felt it myself. Not grief. The thing that comes before grief, when you are still translating what you have just been told into what it actually means. What do you recommend? He said. I had prepared for this question for weeks. I said, I recommend you do not move immediately. Moving immediately gives him time to obscure the trail or transfer remaining assets before you can freeze them. I recommend you spend the next 60 days building an evidentiary record that is sufficient for both a civil claim and, if you choose to pursue it, a referral to financial regulators. I recommend you restructure the board's oversight mechanisms so the CFO has a direct reporting line to you. And I recommend you identify which of Thornfield's assets can be separated into a holding structure under your direct control before Callum has any indication of what is happening. A pause. In Thornfield itself, the operating businesses are recoverable. The energy division needs to be restructured and the debt needs to be renegotiated, but the infrastructure arm is genuinely strong. With the right leadership and the right external advisory, the company can be stabilized within 18 months. He looked at me steadily. You'd take that on, if you wanted me to. We stood in that room for a moment with the cedar smell around us and the quiet street outside, and the last 40 minutes of information sitting between us, like something that had changed the dimensions of the space. There's something else I want to say, Dorian said, and I waited. I've been thinking about this, he said, for some time. He paused, which was not something he did often. About you specifically, not just the work, about whether this is something other than what it appears to be. I said, what does it appear to be? A woman with very specific knowledge appearing at a very specific time. His voice was even. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking you to tell me the truth. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, I knew your son before we met. Not well. We overlapped in a professional context. I lost money in one of his schemes, and I decided not to repeat the experience. This was technically true. I had lost money in another life in another version of this story. But the specifics I was carrying were not things I could explain in any language that would not end the conversation entirely. "That's what I thought," he said. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man who had just been given information he had already prepared for. "You came here with a purpose." "I did." "And the rest of it? What we have been." I said, "The rest of it is real. I can't prove that to you right now. I can only tell you that I have not lied to you about anything that matters." He was quiet. The street was quiet. "I know," he said at last. And that was how it began in earnest. We were engaged by the following spring. I was aware of how this looked. And I was 33 and Dorian was 61, and we had known each other for 14 months. And there was no version of this that would not be discussed in every room where either of our names was mentioned. I was aware of this, and I was not deterred by it. I had spent one life being gentle with other people's opinions about my choices, and the results had been conclusive. We did not announce it quickly. Dorian was a private person, and I had learned in 14 months to match that temperament rather than chafe against it. We told a small number of people first. His lawyer, his longtime business partner, a man called Gideon, who regarded me with a wariness that I respected and did not attempt to overcome directly. My solicitor Crispin, who said, "I see," in the way of a man who has very deliberately decided not to say anything else. Callum found out through someone at a board dinner. He called his father the same evening. I was in Dorian's study when the call came in. Dorian took it in the next room, and I did not move, did not make a show of not listening. I sat with my notebook and heard the shape of it through the wall. Callum's voice raised, then controlled, then raised again. Dorian's voice low and consistent throughout, the voice of a man who has decided something and is not reopening the decision. The call lasted 11 minutes. When Dorian came back, he sat down across from me and said, "He wants to meet you." "All right." "He won't be kind about it." "I know." "You've met him before." It was not a question. By that point, there were several things between us that he knew without my telling him, in the way that some people know things, by the quality of your stillness around certain subjects. "Briefly," I said, "a long time ago." He nodded once, the way he nodded when he was filing something and not asking further. "I'll set it up." The meeting with Callum happened at a hotel bar, neutral ground that was Callum's suggestion, and that I agreed to because the specific neutrality of a hotel bar suited me. I arrived first. I ordered sparkling water and sat with my back to the wall where I could see the entrance. He came in, and I watched him cross the room and felt something I had not expected, which was not hatred. I had thought it would be hatred. What I felt was the specific exhaustion of recognizing something you have seen before and do not need to see again. He was 32 now. He was still beautiful in that particular way. He sat down, looked at me, and for a moment said nothing. He was trying to assess whether he recognized me from somewhere. He did not. "Vivian," he said. "Callum." He picked up the menu, set it down, looked up. "I want to be honest with you. Please. My father he's not always a good judge of people. He gets attached to the wrong things. He did it with my mother, and he did it with several people after her, and I've watched it cause him real damage." I said, "What damage did his marriage to your mother cause him?" A slight pause. "I meant after." "All right. What I'm trying to say is that I want to understand what you want from this relationship." His tone had the precision of someone who had rehearsed this. "He's 61. He's got health concerns I won't go into. The company is at a difficult point in its development." "I know the company's position," I said. "I've spent 6 months studying it." "Then you know it's complicated." "Yes. And that any wife would stand to inherit significantly." I looked at him for a long moment. The bar around us was doing the evening thing it did. The low-level noise of people in motion, glasses being set down, someone nearby laughing. I thought about the morning in my apartment, and the alarm clock, and the smell of cheap coffee, and what it had cost me to get from that morning to this one. I said, "I want to marry your father because I understand him, because what he has built is worth preserving, and I know how to help preserve it, because I am not interested in waiting for someone to leave me something. I intend to build it alongside him." A pause. And because," I said, I find that at this point in my life, I am drawn to men with patience." He heard this. He was intelligent enough to hear it. His jaw moved slightly in a way that suggested he understood the implication and was deciding whether to respond to it directly. He chose not to. "I won't give you my blessing," he said. "I didn't ask for it. We married in October. A private ceremony at a house in the countryside, 12 guests, flowers that Dorian said should be white and that I said could also be something darker. We settled on deep burgundy dahlias and cream roses that sat in low arrangements on the tables and smelled of autumn and something faintly green. Josephine Hadley, Crispin's wife and the only real friend I had carried carefully from my first life, stood beside me. She had been the person I told the truth to. I told not the full truth, not the version with the rebirth and the other life and the accident, but enough. That I was making a considered choice. That the man I was marrying was someone I trusted. That I was not running toward anything, but that I had been away from something for long enough. She held my hand before we went in and said, "You look like someone who knows exactly what they're doing." I said, "I feel like someone who knows exactly what they're doing." "That's the same thing," she said. It wasn't, but I didn't correct her. Dorian was waiting at the end of the room in a dark suit, standing the way he always stood, as if he had no interest in performing his own presence. When I came in, he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had seen in private, but not in front of other people. Something behind the composure. We said our vows. They were short. We had agreed on short because neither of us saw the point of length. Outside afterward, the countryside was gold and cold, and the light was running out of the sky at the horizon. Someone opened champagne. The flute was cold in my hand, and the bubbles rose, and I stood in the grass and looked at the hedgerows and felt something that I could not name precisely. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But the sensation of having moved a weight from one side of a scale to the other. In the first 8 months of the marriage, I worked. Meridian was no longer small. It had grown in the way that businesses grow when they are structured properly from the beginning, not explosively, but steadily, with each new engagement building on the reputation of the last. I had taken on 3 more advisors by the end of the first year, people I chose with the care of someone who had learned the cost of choosing wrong, and we were doing substantive infrastructure finance work for clients who cared about the quality of the analysis. But the real work was Thornfield, with Dorian's authorization and the board's approval. A board that had in the preceding months seen 3 new independent directors join, all at my quiet suggestion, all individuals with impeccable credentials and no existing loyalty to Callum. I had spent those months doing what I had told Dorian I could do. The debt restructuring of the energy division took 4 months and 2 rounds of negotiation with the principal creditors. I was in those meetings. I led them, initially alongside Thornfield's external advisors, and eventually in front of them. Because it became apparent within the first meeting that I understood the numbers better than anyone else in the room. The commercial real estate portfolio was revalued. The markdown was significant, and the internal announcement required careful management. But Dorian trusted me to manage it, and I did. Leopold, the CFO, who had been trying to raise the alarm for 18 months, became one of my closest working relationships. He was meticulous and slightly formal, and had the quality I valued most in a colleague, which was that he was more interested in being right than in being liked. The infrastructure arm received a capital injection that came partly from the proceeds of one asset disposal I recommended, and partly from a new co-investment structure I designed with an institutional partner. Within 6 months, it was generating returns at a rate that Leopold said, with the understatement that was his natural register, that he found encouraging. I was at Thornfield most working days. Not as the CEO. Dorian remained at the helm, which was right for this period, his presence reassuring to clients and counterparties who needed to see continuity. But I was visible. I was known. The people in that organization understood, without being told, that the work I was doing was the work that was keeping the company in the position it needed to be in. And in the meantime, quietly, I was also building the evidentiary record. Crispin had introduced me to a specialist in financial litigation, a woman called Dana Ferriers, who had spent 15 years in regulatory enforcement before moving to private practice, and who had the specific quality of seeming bored by drama and interested only in precision. I liked her immediately. Dana and I worked through the documentation over several months. The Fenwick Capital Partners structure, the payment records, the supply agreements that had been kept in the files without being funded. The series of board approvals that had been obtained through a combination of selective presentation and, in 2 cases, documents that had been subtly altered after the fact. The alteration of documents was the part that mattered most for the regulatory angle. "This is not a civil matter," Dana said at our 3rd meeting. I'm looking at the comparison between 2 versions of the same board approval document, with the particular expression of someone seeing something they expected to see and are still not pleased by. Altering a document to obtain a board authorization is fraud. Yes. He'll argue he had no knowledge of the alterations. He'll say it was a staff error. He'll find it difficult to argue that position, I said, given that the alteration was made from a device registered to him personally at a time when he was the only person with access to the authorization workflow. Dana looked up. I had the metadata extracted from the original file 6 months ago, I said, when I first had access to the document management system. I preserved it in an externally time-stamped archive. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Hey, you've done this before?" "In a manner of speaking." Callum came back to the company in February. This was his own decision, announced through his lawyer to Dorian as a statement of intent to exercise his shareholder rights as a director. Legally, he was entitled. He had not yet been removed from the board. The process for removing him was underway, but had not been completed, and he knew this because he had his own legal team watching. He arrived on a Monday morning in the coat he always wore in winter, the long charcoal one that I remembered from another lifetime, and he walked into the building with the expression of someone establishing a claim. I was in the lobby when he came in, not waiting for him. I had a meeting in 15 minutes, and I happened to be crossing the space. He stopped when he saw me. We had not been in the same building since the hotel bar 18 months earlier. I kept walking and said, "Good morning, Callum," and went upstairs. The board meeting was in March, 14 months after the wedding, 18 months after the evidentiary work had begun in earnest. The agenda item was listed simply as a governance review. Callum's legal team knew something was coming. You cannot prepare a case of this scope without some signal reaching the other side. But they did not know the specific shape. The room was the Thornfield boardroom on the 12th floor. It had a long table, 9 chairs, a view of the city below that on this particular morning was gray and flat, with the specific quality of early spring. The cold that has not yet decided whether to leave. Dorian sat at the head of the table. I sat to his right, which was my usual position in working meetings. Leopold was 2 seats down with the file I had asked him to prepare. Dana Ferrers was present in an advisory capacity at the side of the room. Callum came in with his lawyer and another person I didn't recognize, a young man in a new suit who was doing the thing of looking at everything carefully as if noting exits. They sat down. Callum looked at me and said nothing. The chair of the independent directors opened the meeting. Leopold presented the financial analysis. He did it without drama, the way he did everything, working through the figures with the steady precision of a man reading a map rather than telling a story. The energy division, the debt structure, the revenue projections versus actuals, the payment records, Fenwick Capital Partners, the $11.3 million. Callum's lawyer interrupted twice. Both times the chair asked him to wait. Then I spoke. I presented the document analysis, the 2 versions of the board approval, the metadata, the timestamps, the external archive that had been held by a third-party custodian since the date I had preserved it, making any argument about tampering with the evidence structurally impossible. I did not raise my voice. There was nothing in my voice that I did not intend to put there. When I finished, the room was quiet. Callum was looking at the table. His lawyer said something about needing time to review the materials. The chair said, "Of course." She paused. In the meantime, the board has 3 resolutions to pass. The first is a freezing order on all assets held by entities controlled by or associated with Mr. Jos Ashvale pending the outcome of a full investigation. The second is the suspension of Mr. Ashvale's directorial authority during that investigation. The third is the formal appointment of Mrs. Vivian Ashvale as Executive Director of Thornfield Group with full operational authority. The chair looked around the table. 8 hands went up for each resolution, which was every hand except Callum's. Callum's lawyer looked at his client and said something quietly. Callum did not respond. He was still looking at the table with the expression of someone trying to translate what had just happened into something they can bear to know. Outside the window, the city sat in its gray light. Someone in the room coughed. I pulled the next document from my folder. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way that endings in stories are often dramatic. There was no single confrontation, no door slamming, no grand statement made in front of witnesses. There was the slow and procedural movement of institutions doing what they do. The civil claim was filed. The regulatory referral was made, and Dana managed it with the brisk efficiency of someone who speaks the language fluently. The freezing order held. Fenwick Capital Partners accounts were examined, and the picture they revealed was not different from the picture I had described. Arabella Delphine, it turned out, had been less careful in her own record-keeping than Callum had been. Her emails were recovered, and 2 of them were specific enough about the extraction strategy to constitute, in Dana's assessment, sudden independent basis for proceedings. I did not attend any of the proceedings I was not required to attend. I had Thornfield to run. That was not a small thing. Running a company that has been through what Thornfield had been through, the revelation, the restructuring, the reputational work of demonstrating to the market that the problems were identified and addressed, was the kind of work that required everything. I gave it everything. Dorian was present through all of it. Not as the executive, not in the operational day-to-day, but in the way that a co-founder is present, at the edges of decisions, available when needed, carrying in his institutional knowledge of the company and its history a resource I used regularly. We had built, over the preceding year and a half, a working language. The shorthand of 2 people who have been through something difficult together and emerged on the same side. There were evenings in the house that smelled of cedar when we sat together and did not talk about the company at all. He had a garden he was serious about, and I was learning, in the way of someone who has never grown anything, to find that interesting. He was patient with my ignorance, which I suspected he found mildly amusing, and I was patient with his tendency to talk about soil drainage at length, which I suspected I found mildly tedious. These evenings were something I had not planned for. I had planned for the work. I had planned for the victory, which was not a moment but a process. I had not planned for what it would feel like to sit in someone's garden in the early summer with a glass of something cold and feel something that was simply ordinary. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter than that. It was the first time in a very long time that I had been somewhere I had chosen and felt the choice had been right. Meridian continued to grow alongside the Thornfield work. By the end of the 2nd year of the marriage, it had 8 advisors, 17 active clients, and a reputation in infrastructure finance that was independent of Thornfield's name. I had been careful about this from the beginning. Meridian was mine. It had been built on my capital, my intellectual property, my relationships. Every client contract was in Meridian's name. So now the fee income was structured so that it went to Meridian's accounts and nowhere else. Crispin had made sure the shareholder structure was clean, the IP registrations were comprehensive, and the operating agreement was unambiguous about ownership. I had also been building Meridian's capability in a direction that was not obvious from the outside. The company had developed, alongside its advisory work, a proprietary analysis framework for infrastructure asset valuation. It was not remarkable in concept. Asset valuation methodology had been the subject of academic work for decades, but the specific combination of variables we used and the weighting model we had developed over 2 years of testing against real outcomes was, according to 3 independent experts I had consulted, genuinely novel. Crispin had filed the IP registration. As the methodology was protected, I mention this because it became relevant. The civil proceedings concluded in the autumn of the 2nd year. The outcome was not what Callum's legal team had argued for. The $11.3 million was required to be repaid. The claim for consequential losses to Thornfield was partially upheld at a figure that brought the total recovery to just under $16 million. Callum's shareholding in Thornfield Group, which had been the principal asset he had not moved into Fenwick's structure, was transferred to Thornfield's treasury under the settlement terms as partial satisfaction. His directorship was extinguished. The regulatory referral produced, 8 months after it was filed, a formal finding of misconduct and a prohibition order preventing him from holding a directorial position in any regulated entity for 7 years. Arabella Delphine reached a separate settlement whose terms were confidential, which meant they were not good for her. I was not in court for the final judgment. I was in a meeting with the infrastructure arm's new institutional co-investor, presenting Q 4 performance figures that Leopold had prepared and that I was, for the first time in the 2 years of running this company, genuinely pleased with. Leopold put his head around the door afterward and said, "It went as expected." I said, "Good." He said, "There is one more thing." He set a piece of paper on the desk. "He's applied for a position at Meridian." I looked at the paper. A standard application form, a name and employment history, and a covering letter. The name was Callum Ashfield. I read the covering letter. It was well written, which I expected. He had always been good at framing. He was experienced, technically, in infrastructure finance, having spent 4 years in Thornfield's energy division before the restructuring. The experience was real, even if the manner in which he had applied it was not. He was, by his own account, looking to rebuild after a period he described as one of professional and personal difficulty. I put the letter down. Leopold was watching me with the expression of someone waiting to take an instruction. I said, "Put him through the standard process. Have Ferris do the technical assessment, and have Hadley review the compliance history. And if he passes the process," I thought for a moment. "If he passes the process, he passes the process," I said. He passed the process. Ferris, who ran our technical assessments, said he was competent at the mid-level, capable with the modeling tools, knowledgeable about the asset classes. Not exceptional, but solid. Hadley, who handled compliance due diligence, noted the prohibition order, noted the civil settlement, and noted that neither of these precluded employment in a non-directorial, non-regulated capacity. He flagged the conflict of interest arising from the relationship and recommended that this be formally declared and documented before any offer was made. I signed the conflict declaration myself. The offer letter went out at a mid-level analyst grade with a standard package. Not entry-level, which would have been a statement, and not senior. Anyway, because the seniority needed to be earned. The letter was from Meridian's HR function, the same letter any candidate at that grade would receive. He accepted within a week. His first day was a Tuesday in early November. I was not in the office that morning. I was at Thornfield for a financing committee meeting that ran until noon, and then I had lunch with Dorian at the house, which we did on Tuesdays when the schedule allowed. The cedar smell was in the hallway when I came in, and the kitchen smelled of whatever the housekeeper had left warming on the stove. And the November light was low and gold through the windows. Dorian looked up from the newspaper and said, "How was the committee?" "Good. The tranche pricing came in better than we modeled." "And the other thing?" I poured water from the jug on the table and sat down. Well, he started today. Dorian put the newspaper flat. He did not say anything for a moment. I said, "You think it was the wrong decision?" "I think it was a decision I wouldn't have made." He was careful about this, as he was about most things that touched the parts of the story that still carried weight for him. The son he had spent 40 years loving, and a year and a half watching become someone else. "But I'm not running Meridian." "No. What do you want from it?" he asked. It was a good question. It was the question I'd been asking myself. I said, "I want to see if he can do it." "Do what?" "Earn something." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the garden was bare, and the light was falling across the empty beds. He had finished putting it to rest for the winter 2 weeks ago, as the careful work of tidying and covering and preparing the ground for what was coming. "That's not mercy," he said. "No," I said. "It's not." 3 weeks into his employment, I came into Meridian's offices for the first time since he had started. I went in on a Wednesday mid-morning and went directly to my office without going through the analyst floor. I spent an hour on calls and 2 hours on a document I was reviewing. At some point, Ferris knocked and came in with a question about the valuation framework, and I answered it, and he went. At 1 p.m, I went to get coffee from the kitchen. He was there. He had his back to the door, looking at something on his phone, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its cycle. Oh, he heard me come in and turned, and for a moment we looked at each other without either of us having prepared for the specific situation. He looked different. Not dramatically. He was thinner, slightly. The quality of confidence that had always been so physically present in him was still there but sitting differently, like something that had been set down for a moment and not yet picked back up. He said, "Mrs. Asheville?" I said, "Good morning." The coffee machine finished its cycle with a sound it always made, a small mechanical sigh. He picked up his cup. I took mine from the stand. He said, "I want to say something." I looked at him and waited. I know what I did. His voice was even. It did not have the quality of rehearsal I had heard in the hotel bar 2 years ago. Not to the company, to you. I know you had investments through my network before. I know what happened to them." I held my coffee cup and looked at him. "I'm not asking you to forgive it," he said. "I just want you to know that I know." I said, "Drink your coffee before it gets cold." He nodded once, in a way that said he had understood what the statement meant, which was that the subject was closed, and had been for some time, and was not one I needed to revisit. I went back to my office. There is a window in my office at Meridian that looks out over the eastern side of the city. On clear days in winter, when the light is low and very white, you can see the infrastructure of the thing, the bridges and the crane frames and the dark line of the river running through the middle of it all. I sat at my desk in November, in the 3rd year of my second life, and looked out at the city and thought about what it had taken to get here. Not in the accounting way, not counting the moves or the months or the figures on the pages I had worked through in 2 years of documents. In the other way. The way that sometimes comes at the end of something, when you are sitting quietly and the noise of what has just finished is still settling. I had come back with a precise intention and a general direction, and everything between the intention and the direction had been improvisation. The plan had not been a plan so much as a knowledge of what I was protecting against and a willingness to work with whatever materials were available. The material that surprised me most was Dorian. I had gone to him with a strategy. He had met me with a complexity I had not been prepared for. And he was not the man I had dismissed from a distance, not the cold and distant father at the end of a table. He was a person who had made real mistakes and who knew it, who had loved something for 40 years and watched it go wrong without understanding how, and who was, underneath the composure and the patience, someone still capable of being surprised. He surprised me regularly. I had not planned for that. I had planned for usefulness and credibility and professional respect, and I had received those things. I had not planned to come home on a Tuesday evening to find him in the kitchen attempting a recipe he had torn from a magazine and making a mess that was, by his own assessment, not quite what was described, and to stand in the doorway laughing at the expression on his face. I had not planned to feel ordinary in the way I felt ordinary in that house. I had planned a second life that was a correction of the first. I had not planned for it to become, in its own right, a life. In the spring of the 3rd year, Dorian stepped down from Thornfield's chairmanship. It was his decision, and he made it carefully, over several months, in conversation with the board, and with me, and with his own sense of what the company needed next. Thornfield was stable. The restructuring had held, the infrastructure arm was performing, and the energy division had been properly recapitalized and was now projecting figures that were, unlike its previous figures, supportable. The company needed a chair who was not carrying the weight of the previous period, not in terms of capability, but in terms of the symbolic function a chair performs for clients, counterparties, and the market generally. Dorian understood this with the clarity of someone who has built something over 40 years, and knows better than most that what it needs at any given moment is not always what you want to give it. He recommended me to the board as his successor. There was discussion. There was the expected range of opinions from the expected range of people. 2 of the independent directors were enthusiastic. One was cautious. One was cautious in a way that I recognized had nothing to do with my qualifications and everything to do with the fact that I was 36 and female and had been at the company for less time than several people in the room. I did not argue this point in the room. I let the record argue it. 2 years of operational performance, a recovery that the market had described in terms I would not repeat because I have never found it useful to repeat praise, and a financing relationship with the institutional co-investor that had become, by that point, one of Thornfield's most valuable partnerships. The vote was 7-1. On the day I signed the papers, formalizing my appointment as executive chair of Thornfield Group, I was also signing the documentation for Meridian's expansion into a new service line, direct infrastructure investment, using our proprietary valuation methodology as the analytical foundation of a small but carefully structured fund. The fund was not large. It was intentionally not large. I had learned from Thornfield, among other things, how's the specific cost of growing faster than your understanding of what you are doing. Meridian's fund would invest in what we could model at a size we could service, and it would do this without the noise of public commitment to returns we could not guarantee. Crispin reviewed both sets of papers before I signed. He had been doing this for 3 years and had developed the habit of reading everything twice, which I appreciated. He said, "Congratulations on both." I said, "Which one do you mean?" "Both," he said. "I mean both." There is a particular quality to the late afternoon on a Friday in spring in the offices of a company that has found its footing. The noise level drops, and there is a particular texture to the remaining activity, the people finishing things rather than beginning them. Almost the quality of the light changing as it comes lower through the windows. I was at Meridian on one such Friday, later than I had planned, working through the final documentation for the fund's first investment. The office was quiet by 6. By 7, it was mostly empty. At some point, I became aware that there was still someone at a desk on the analyst floor. I walked to the glass partition and looked out. Callum was at his screen with a spreadsheet open, working through something. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled, and the expression he wore when he was concentrating, which I recognized from another lifetime and which, stripped of everything else, was just the expression of someone trying to get something right. He had been here 7 months. He had not missed a day. Ferris said his work was improving, but that he was developing the kind of care for the technical detail that he had not shown in his previous career. He asked questions before making assumptions. He checked his numbers. He did not perform. I watched him for a moment. Then I went back to my desk and finished what I was doing. I drove home at 8 in the evening, out through the city's last traffic, and into the quieter streets and then the residential lanes, the particular transition from urban to still that this route always made. The car had a hum to it, low and consistent, and the spring evening through the window smelled of something just beginning to grow. Dorian was in the garden when I came in. He had a light on, one of the low external lamps he used when he was working in the evening, and from the kitchen window, I could see him moving slowly along one of the beds. So doing whatever he did at this hour. I changed out of work clothes and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window and watched him. He came in at 8:30, leaving his garden shoes by the door, and he looked at the kettle and at me and said, "Good day?" "Productive," I said. "Signed the fund documents." "And Thornfield?" "I'll tell you over dinner." I poured water into both cups. "How's the bed by the east wall?" He looked at me with the mild expression he wore when I asked about the garden, which was the expression of someone registering that you are learning and deciding not to make a production of it. "The soil temperature is finally where it needs to be." "Is that good?" "It means we can put the dahlias in next week." I handed him his tea. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the cedar-smelling house, us in the quiet of the evening, in the ordinary way of 2 people at the end of a day. I thought about a crack in a ceiling, a date on an alarm clock, the cold water in a sink, and the face in the mirror with nothing in it yet. Everything between that morning and this evening. I did not allow the thought to finish. There was nothing productive in finishing it. "Next week," I said, "show me how to plant them." He looked at me. Something changed in his face. Briefly, the way something changes when you are given something you did not expect. "All right," he said. In the building on the east side of the city, on the analyst floor of Meridian Advisory's offices, a spreadsheet was open on a screen. In the morning, when I came back, it would be there waiting, the work half done, the numbers carrying forward to a line that had not been reached yet. He would come in and finish it. That was all. That was exactly all. Dorian turned 63 in the summer, and we had 8 people to dinner, in the garden, with low lanterns and the summer smell of cut grass and something on the grill. Josephine was there, with Crispin, and Leopold and his wife, and 2 other couples who had been in our lives long enough that the dinner had no performance in it. At some point, Josephine came to find me where I was standing at the edge of the garden, away from the table, looking at the line of the hedge against the evening sky. She stood beside me and said, "You look like someone who's finished something." I said, "I'm starting something new in September, a second fund." She gave me a look that said she knew that was not what she meant. I looked at the hedge for a moment. I used to think the point was the ending," I said, getting to the point where a specific thing had been undone. And now, I listened to the voices behind us, the specific sound of people at a table who know each other well. Dorian's voice among them, dry and unhurried, saying something that made someone laugh. "Now I think the ending is just when the next thing starts," I said. Josephine said nothing. She was the kind of person who knew when not to fill a silence. We stood there for another moment. Above the hedge, the sky was still light at the very edge, the last of it, the deepest blue before the dark. Then someone called us back to the table and we went. The second fund launched in September. It was not significantly larger than the first. I had a meeting with a potential institutional anchor investor in October who offered to double the target capitalization in exchange for a governance seat. And I declined, which surprised them, and which I explained by saying that Meridian's independence was a structural feature of the product and not negotiable. They came back in November with a revised offer that did not include the governance seat. I accepted. At the same time, Thornfield's energy division closed its first profitable quarter since the original expansion, 3 years after the restructuring had begun. Leopold sent me the figures on a Tuesday morning with a note that said simply, "As modeled." I printed the note and pinned it to the board above my desk, which was not something I usually did with documents. Callum's 12-month review at Meridian happened in November. Ferris conducted it and afterward reported to me with the standard summary. Performance, solid, trending upward. Technical skills, improved materially. Client interaction, limited per his grade, but professional when it occurred. Areas for development, still tended to overconfidence in initial modeling assumptions, a habit that Ferris said he was addressing through the feedback process. I said, "Renew at the same grade, standard uplift." Ferris said, "He's ready for a more senior brief. The Westmere Infrastructure Assessment, standard uplift." I said. "He can apply for the Westmere brief when it comes to open allocation." Ferris nodded. He understood, in the way that good people who work alongside you begin to understand, that this was not about capacity but about something else, about the specific pace of earning. The Westmere brief came to open allocation in December. Callum applied, he was allocated the assignment. The Westmere report was due in February. He submitted it on time, which I noted, and I reviewed it myself, which I did not usually do with analyst-level work. It was good, better than I expected. The methodology was careful and the risk modeling was thorough, and there was a section on the regulatory environment that showed a level of understanding I had not seen from him before, the understanding that comes from actually engaging with something rather than skating across the surface. I approved it with 2 minor revisions. I sent the revisions through Ferris without a cover note. He revised and resubmitted within 24 hours. The second version was correct. By the end of the 3rd year, Meridian had 12 advisors, all 2 active funds with a combined portfolio of 14 investments, and a reputation that was specific enough to be useful. We were not the largest firm in our market. We were not trying to be. What we were was increasingly well understood. A team with a methodology that was genuinely proprietary, a track record that was now long enough to be meaningful, and a discipline about what we would and would not do that the market, over time, had come to see as a feature. I had been thinking about the next phase for some months. Not a 3rd fund, though that would come. What I was thinking about was something structural. The application of the valuation methodology to a public market product. Not a listed vehicle that would allow institutional and eventually retail participation in infrastructure assets that were currently accessible only to large private allocators. It was a larger ambition than anything I had taken on before. It required regulatory approval, an expanded team, a different kind of investor relations capability. It was the kind of thing that would take 3 years to build and would require absolute clarity about what we were doing and why. I spent 6 months thinking about it carefully before I said it out loud. I said it first to Dorian on a Sunday morning in the garden while he was cutting back the last of the autumn growth. He listened with the quality of attention he gave to things he was taking seriously, which was all of them, and then he was quiet for a moment and said, "Oh, you've already decided." "I want to know what you think." I think you've already decided, he said, and I think you're right. He picked up the pruning shears and went back to what he was doing. I stood in the garden in the November cold and looked at the bones of the dahlia bed, cleared and covered now, waiting for the spring. The application for authorization was submitted in January of the 4th year. Dana Ferrers, who had transitioned from pure litigation work into a broader advisory role for Meridian, managed the regulatory process. She was, as she always was, precise, minimally dramatic, 3 steps ahead of the questions that would be asked. The authorization process took 8 months. During those 8 months, I continued to run Thornfield and Meridian in parallel, which was, by that point, a rhythm I had built into my working week with the kind of structuralism that comes from having done something complex for long enough that you stop experiencing the complexity and simply experience the work. Callum had been at Meridian for 18 months. He was producing, by that point, consistently solid work. Not exceptional. I did not expect exceptional. I expected accurate, thorough, professional, and that was what I was getting. He had applied for a senior analyst position in the summer and been allocated it after the standard process. At his 18-month mark, I did something I had not done since the day in the kitchen with the coffee cups. I had a conversation with him. Not about anything material. It was one of the brief passing exchanges that happened in the corridor, in the kitchen, in the margins of working days. Until I passed him in the corridor outside the conference room where he had just come out of a client briefing, and I said, "The Westmere follow-up." He stopped. "Yes." The counterparty question at the end. "How did you arrive at that framing?" He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether this was a test. He decided it was not, which was correct. I went back to the original covenant documentation. There was a clause the client hadn't flagged that created a potential liability in the change of use scenario. I thought it was worth raising. It was. He said nothing. I said, "Good instinct." And I kept walking. The authorization came through in September. We launched the public vehicle in November. And at an event in a building in the financial district that I had chosen because it had good acoustics and not because it was impressive. There were institutional investors there, regulatory representatives, journalists from the finance press, people from the infrastructure sector who were curious about the methodology. I gave a brief address. I talked about the framework. I talked about the track record. I did not talk about the origin story because the origin story was mine, and I had no interest in giving it to a room. Afterward, there was a reception, and I spent 2 hours in conversations that were productive and not particularly personal, and by the end of it, I was ready for the quiet of the car, and then the house, and the cedar smell, and whatever Dorian had made for dinner. He had made something with the last of the season's vegetables from the garden, something he said he found in a book and then modified because the book was, in his assessment, overly cautious with salt. It was very good. We ate at the kitchen table, and I told him about the reception, and he told me about the garden and what he was planning for the spring, the new bed he was thinking about along the south wall, and whether the soil there was what it needed to be or whether it needed amending. I said, "Amend it, do it properly." He said, "That's what I thought." In the spring of the 4th year, I planted dahlias, not with the expertise of someone who knew what they were doing, with the patience of someone learning how, which is different. Dorian stood at my shoulder and said when I was going too deep and when I was going too shallow, and I adjusted without comment and worked through the bed from the east end. The light was the particular light of early spring mornings, thin and white and very still. When we were done, I stood and looked at the marked earth and felt the cold of the soil on my hands and the chill of the morning on my face. Dorian said, "In 3 months." I said, "I know." He went inside. I stayed for another moment, looking at the bed. 3 months. I thought about a morning 4 years ago with a crack in the ceiling and a date on a clock and the sound of a garbage truck outside and the particular stillness of understanding that you have been given something unlikely. I had known, that morning, what I was going to do. I had not known what I was going to find. When I looked at the marked earth, in 3 months, dahlias. In the building on the east side of the city, at a desk that looked out over the low rooftops toward the river, a man sat with a spreadsheet open on his screen and worked through the numbers carefully, the way you work when you are trying to get something right. And there is no one to impress, and the only question is whether the answer is correct. He checked his figures. He found an error. He corrected it. He had to be here in an hour. He had a client briefing at 10 and a model to finish before it, and enough work for the afternoon to take him past 5. He saved the file. He made coffee. He came back to his desk and started again.